So this last couple of weeks, my children and I have been reading the novel Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. And a couple of weeks ago, we got to that part near the end where there's the trial of Muff Potter. If you've read it before, Muff Potter was accused of murdering a doctor in a graveyard. Now, Muff Potter was no murderer, but he was a drunk. And he was so drunk that on the night of the crime, he didn't even know if he was innocent or not. But Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn knew that Muff Potter was innocent because they were hiding in the shadows in the graveyard. And they knew who the real murderer was. But lest they actually be killed themselves, they vowed that they would keep silent. But as Tom sat in the trial, as he sat in the courtroom, and as this court plays out, he listens to all the evidence, and he knows that everything's stacked up against Muff Potter, and that the judge is going to find him as guilty of sin, and that he is surely going to hang for a crime that he didn't commit. And as he watches all of this take place, finally, Tom's conscience gets the best of him, and he steps forward and defends Muff Potter's innocence, and he becomes the hero. In Job 27 and 28, these are the closing arguments of a court case. Job's friends have made their case that Job suffered justly for his sin, but Job, on the other hand, claims his innocence. Unlike Tom Sawyer, though, no one steps forward to defend him. God is the only one who can vindicate Job, and yet he stays in the shadows. C.S. Lewis, in his famous book on grief, reflects on the death of his wife and says this: "But go to God when you are desperate, when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain. What do you find? A door slammed in your face, a sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside, and after that, silence. You may as well turn away. The longer you wait, the more emphatic the silence will become. There are no lights in the windows. It might be an empty house. Was it ever inhabited? It seemed so once. And that seeming was so strong as this. What can this mean?" And this is what Lewis says, and we can all relate to this. Why is he so present, a commander in our time of prosperity, and so very absent to help in time of trouble? And if we're honest, we felt like that before. We feel like God hasn't shown up yet to make things right. So what does Job do when God never steps forward to defend him? Amazingly, even though he says some difficult things, he says some severe things, he never gives up calling out to God. And now we get to listen to Job's closing arguments. And his first... You're going to have to bear with me this morning. I got this nasty cough, and I feel like I've been overdosing on cough drops. So here we go. You guys ready to go? So we go through, we're listening to Job's closing arguments, and as he goes through this, he begins to say some incredibly severe things. But what he keeps coming back to is that he's going to defend his integrity. And his first thing that he maintains as we go through this, and if you guys can help me with the clicker, is that Job defends the fact that he lives for righteousness more than getting the paycheck. And in Job 27, he goes through three sections. There's three parts to this, as he defends the fact that he's living more for his righteousness than getting the paycheck. And the first thing that Job does is that Job defends his integrity. So let's just review for a moment the accusations against Job. Job's friends rest their entire case on their understanding of the retributive principle. And Pastor Mike has been teaching us about that this week. And that is, be good and be blessed, or be bad and be cursed. Job, you've been cursed, therefore you have been bad. And therefore they argue that the greatest incentive for being righteous is to get a blessing, and the greatest incentive for not being bad is to avoid suffering. And what Job's friends do is they not only present the wisdom of this world and this retributive principle, but they also end up arguing Satan's case as well. Because Satan, at the beginning of the book, says that the only reason people are ever good is because you bless them. And Job's friends, his accusers, in a very demented way of defending God, end up siding with Satan. If you were ever good, Job, it was just so that you could get stuff. And his friends keep badgering him for 26 chapters in order to get a false confession out of him. Admit that you are guilty, they say. Confess your sin and be restored. So we get to the end of this entire courtroom scene where Job's accusers have argued and yelled and slandered while Job objected. And 26 chapters of this, and we're still at an impasse. We haven't come to any solutions yet. And thus far, there have been just cycles of this court case. It's been Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar. And in this third cycle, it goes Eliphaz, Bildad, and then we never hear from Zophar. And we're not sure why. It's either that Zophar is done speaking or that Job is done listening. And in verse 1 of chapter 27, Job continues his discourse as if to say, I'm done. I'm done speaking with you. I will only speak to God. I'm staking everything on a God of justice beyond this injustice. So look at verse 2. He says, as God lives, who has deprived me of justice, and the Almighty who has made me bitter, as long as my breath is still in me, and the breath from my God remains in my nostrils, my lips will not speak unjustly. My tongue will not utter deceit. I will never affirm that you are right. I will maintain my integrity until I die. I will cling to my righteousness and never let go. My conscience will not accuse me as long as I live. And the first thing that Job does here is he makes a powerful oath by invoking God. He knows that even though he feels crushed by God, God is the only one can help him. And he's asked God for help at many times, but here in verse 2, he does something absolutely amazing. He now swears by the life of God. And he just says some very profound things. May God kill me if I am wrong. I am never going to give in to you. And at this point, what he's trying to do is he's trying to say, I'm done listening to anybody else. I'm only going to listen to God. And right now, by swearing on him, I am forcing God's hand. I swear on the Bible, I'll be damned if I have ever proved wrong on something like this. That's how strong he is sitting at this point. Now, Job's not shaking his fist at God, but he knows that only God can help him. Now, at this point, it looks like Job is just a little bit arrogant, right? We look at that and you're like, he maintains his righteousness. And Job's not saying here that he has always been a perfect person, but he just says, I'm going to cling to my integrity until I die. And he's said some really strange things up until this point, but he's not claiming to be perfect. All he's saying is, according to what you guys are saying, the math doesn't add up. And I'm not going to confess to something just to get my blessing back. In fact, to confess to something that I didn't do would actually be to violate my own conscience. And so in verse 6, he says, I will cling to my righteousness. I will never let it go. My conscience will not accuse me as long as I live. Now, many people will confess to a crime that they didn't commit after only 24 hours of interrogation, but Job says, as long as I live, I will maintain my righteousness. What we've learned so far is that Job wasn't suffering because he was doing evil, but Job also argues that he didn't do good just so that he would be blessed. Remember when he lost everything? Everything disappears. What did Job do? Even in that, Job still did not sin. And Job insists that if you dive into the depths of his soul, his deepest motivation for righteousness isn't living for wealth or reward. My righteousness, the way I lived, wasn't just to get stuff. My righteousness wasn't to be wealthy or healthy. And how many of us could say that? If we lost everything, that our greatest priority would be to live for our integrity. And Proverbs 22:1 says, a good name is better than wealth. A good name is to be chosen over great wealth, and favor better than silver and gold. And that's what Job wants at this point, is he wants to defend his integrity. Job did not live, he argues, by a merit-based system. He says, I don't know how this world is working out right now. I don't know what the math is, but that's not the way that I was living. And he's just frustrated that he can't understand how the world operates. And he maintains his righteousness for his own sake. He's not like so many pagans, or so many Christians for that matter, who think that they can bargain with the gods with their sacrifice in order to attain an easier life, or that assume that if they're suffering, the suffering they face is somehow the sign of the God's displeasure. But when Job does good, even when he suffers, it proves that he is living for righteousness more than just getting the paycheck. So what does Job do next? So the next thing that Job does is he actually prays for judgment against his accusers. Just look at this for a moment. This rest of this chapter actually catches us off guard. And we wonder, some of us, if Job actually said this, because it actually sounds so harsh that we think that it's more like Zophar. But I believe that this is still Job. He prays in verse 7, "May my enemy be like the wicked, and my opponent be like the unjust. For what hope does the godless person have when he is cut off, when he takes away his life?" So who's Job praying against at this point? He's praying against wicked people who are accusing him. He's praying against his friends. And this sounds strange, but this is exactly what he does. He prays against his friends. They had brought false charges against him. In Israelite law, to bring false charge against an innocent person, if you did that, you then would be guilty and you would deserve the punishment for the crime that you accuse that person of. Does that make sense? So if you accuse an innocent person of theft, then you could be punished as a thief. If you accuse an innocent person wrongly of murder, you could be punished as a murderer. And that's exactly what Job is praying for. You have accused me of being wicked. Now may God treat you as the wicked person that you say that I am. And in a very poetic way, he actually goes on to describe the judgment of the wicked in the next few verses. And he walks through and describes the destruction of the wicked. And listen to this. He goes through in almost a very poetic way. First of all, he says their families will be destroyed. This is a wicked man's lot from God. This is a wicked man's lot from God. The inheritance the ruthless will receive from the Almighty. Even if his children increase, they are destined for the sword. His descendants will never have enough food. Those who survive will be buried by the plague, yet their widows will not weep for him. And then he goes on to say that their riches will be lost, though he piles up silver like dust. And there's just beautiful poetry here that silver, they have so much silver that it's equated with dust, and at the same time, what is silver but dust in this world, and it's going to blow away. Though he piles up silver like dust and heaps fine clothing like clay, he may heap it up, but righteous will wear out, and the innocent will divide his silver. It's all going to go to other people. And eventually their security will fade away. The house that he built the houses that they built, they're going to fall apart like a temporary dwelling, like a moth's cocoon, or like a hunter's little tent. And eventually, he says, they will die. In a very poetic way, he describes the destruction of the wicked. And in Job 27, there's both a warning and there is good news. The warning is this: be careful of accusing those that God has justified, lest you oppose God. Be very careful if we presume to speak for God when we cannot see behind the scenes. But there's also good news here. As we look through this is an incredible prayer for judgment against accusers, and he describes the horrible destruction. But eventually, Job's friends do, as we get to the end of the book, we see that they do change their minds and that they experience forgiveness, and they do not eventually receive this destruction. But there's also this good news as well. One day, the accuser, Satan, will be delivered into hell, where he will experience the justice of God for all eternity. And for all the lies that he has told, and all the deception that he has created, and all the temptation that he has offered, and all the ways that Satan has undermined the glory of God, he will be cast into the lake of fire. And so even though Job's friends, we can rejoice that his friends are forgiven, we can also rejoice that one day all things will be made right at the destruction of Satan. And Job first says he's living for righteousness more than the paycheck. What do I mean by that? First of all, what don't I mean when I say that? I don't mean that having a motive of reward or joy is a bad thing. Over 200 years ago, there was a famous philosopher who argued, and he was an atheist, who argued that the only way to be truly good was to be completely void of any desire. You couldn't seek any benefit from the act. So if you wanted to go out and do something good for your neighbor, if you saw any good, even if you felt good about it afterwards, what you would do, this philosopher argued, is that if there was any reward, even to the point of feeling good about it, then you would have invalidated that or ruined that good. If you derive joy in doing good, then it's actually bad. And so the only way to be good is to be devoid of any desire. So that's what one philosopher argued. So when I say that Job lives for righteousness more than a paycheck, I'm not wanting us to fall into that trap, because the Bible, and many times, over and over again, puts reward, our joy, our crown, our Savior before us as a motivation. And God even calls himself the rewarder of those who seek him. So when I say that Job wasn't seeking the paycheck, what I'm not saying is that being motivated is a bad thing. So what do I mean? This is what I mean. Once every couple of days, and sometimes it feels like twice or two or three times a day, I tell my kids, go clean the basement. The basement's their playroom where a lot of their toys are. And sometimes I think that the best way to get my kids distracted for a while is just to say, hey, go clean the basement. And if you give them a cleaning job, then they'll disappear and they won't do it, but at least they'll be distracted for a really long time. So I say to my girls, go clean the basement. And I can see their minds starting to work a little bit, because they're starting to do the mental math of weighing the benefits of obedience versus the cost of disobedience. And you can see them actually processing this at this point. And so sometimes the kids want to know, what's in it for me? What's the point? What am I going to get out of it if I actually go clean up the basement? And if there's no snack or no show at the end of it, then I can just see their fingers working it out. Is it really worthwhile to do this? It's probably not that important. Is a small snack really worth this giant mess? Or sometimes I can see them processing it a different way, and I'm like, okay, is there going to be a consequence at the end of this that we don't want to do? And they're calculating this out. And do we really think that Dad will carry through with this? I mean, he forgot last time, so maybe we can just risk it. And isn't really a moment of discomfort a small price to pay for our own freedom? And what are they doing in that moment? They're calculating the paycheck. And we see that all the time in our kids, or my kids. Maybe your kids have never done that, but we do that all the time. We evaluate our suffering through a merit system, but we also base our obedience on it as well. If I see that piece of garbage that I dropped, do I stop to pick it up? Well, it's like, well, I don't know. I could do it for a moment, but I'd have to do a little bit of extra work. If I don't, my conscience will eat at me, but it's not that big of a deal. I can just move on. Perhaps we pursue the paycheck not just with God, but with man. I mean, I learned a long time ago when I was a banker that the best way to look busy is to walk fast and keep a messy desk. And if you walk fast and keep a messy desk, then nobody will interrupt you, because they think that you are busier than you actually are. So what motivates us when we do business? It's like, well, I'm gonna follow God's business principles because I think it'll work well for me in the end. But then what happens when it doesn't work out well? What happens when you go through all of high school and you tried to honor God with your time and with your body, and you get to the end and you still have to wait until you're 30 when you get married? And I've heard people say that before. Where was the paycheck? What was the point of the righteousness? God, I tried to honor you in my business, but I still didn't get any paycheck. The guy next door, who I know is crooked, it's still working out for him. And what Job says is, I'm not just ultimately living for the paycheck. And if your motivation is ultimately for what you get in life, it's going to fall apart. So Job stands for us as an amazing example. When he is put on trial, he is found innocent, and he has maintained his integrity. If we were put on trial for our motives, what would we be found guilty for? So how can we live for righteousness? How can we live for righteousness more than living for the paycheck? Isn't it great when you are just reading through Scripture and it comes to you in your own Bible reading? This week I've been reading through 1 Peter, and in 1 Peter 2, he says this, "For it is the gracious thing when mindful of God, one endures sorrow while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if you, when you sin, are beaten? Or for what credit is it if when you sin and are beaten, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer but if you do good and suffer for what you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to do this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When Jesus was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued to entrust himself to the one who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. And Jesus Christ left for us an example of suffering unjustly for the unjust, but he did more than that. He actually bore our sins in his body on our tree, so that now we are free, and as believers we can live free from the fear and we can know that our greatest identity is wrapped up in Jesus Christ. And it's the gospel now that frees us from this merit-based system of living for the paycheck. And when the gospel, rather than a merit-based system, shapes our identity, that frees us to work hard, to pursue everything, even if we fail. So students, think about this. I was speaking with a Christian school teacher recently, and I just loved what she shared about motivation and finding our identity in Christ, even as it comes to working hard in school. If you are working for the grade at the end of everything, eventually that's not going to measure up. It's never going to be good enough. But if you understand that your identity isn't just found in the grade that you get in your school, but that your identity is found in Jesus Christ, what that does is it frees you from the pressure on the outside in order to both work hard and not boast when you get the good grade, and to work hard and fail, knowing even when you fail, you know that you have an identity in something greater. We are free to obey our boss because we know that we have a master in heaven. And we can live for righteousness because Jesus Christ has already given us his righteousness. So Job points us to live for righteousness beyond the paycheck, and it points us eventually to Jesus Christ, who is our righteousness. In Job 27, Job says that it is only God who can bring him justice, and he will never give up defending his integrity. At this point, he's not boasting in himself. He sees himself the way God sees him. And at this point, Job just is saying, God, I can't understand the design of this world, and so I need to hear from you, the designer. In Job's closing arguments, what he does is he maintains his innocence. And now in Job 28, we come to this next chapter, and there's just a change of feel here. Up until this point, the book of Job has been boiling over with tension at the outcry of Job's heart and the accusations of Job's friends. And at Job 28, it's as if Job just takes a breath and ponders deep truths. And that's what we're supposed to do at this point, to take a breath and ponder deep truths. And Job 28 is a beautiful, calm poem, and some might even say it's a hymn about wisdom. And it almost feels like it doesn't fit, but I think that it does fit. These verses have such a stark contrast to what has come before that some would say that if this were a Greek play, this would be the choir coming in. If this was a Shakespeare play, this would be the choir coming in. Or we might even say if this is a Disney movie, this is that choir interlude where there's a song at this point. And this is a song about wisdom. So look at verse 20, or chapter 28, verse 12. It says, "But where can wisdom be found? And where is understanding located?" And then in verse 20, it says, "Where does wisdom come from? And where is understanding located?" And so Job takes us on this tour all over and under the earth on a search for wisdom to find its source. What is the governing principle behind God's administration? That's been the question that we continue to ask through the book of Job. What happens behind the curtain? What is the algorithm of the universe? What is the theory of everything? Where is justice to be found? And chapter 28 is like the conclusion before we actually get to the conclusion. And in these verses, what Job learns next is that Job learns that wisdom is more than having the answers. And he takes us on this worldwide journey to find wisdom. And when I say wisdom, I don't just mean skill in living. I mean the order of the universe, the answer to all of life's toughest questions. And the first thing we learn is that wisdom can't be sought. So a few years ago, my kids were really into Minecraft. And I'll admit it, I was kind of into Minecraft too. It's a video game, and it's one of those video games that puts parents in a really awkward position, because on the one hand, it's a video game, and we're supposed to not have screens, and that's not a good thing to play with screens all day. On the other hand, it's a game of design and creativity, in which kids get to go mine for ore and gold, and they get to build castles and worlds, and it's really fun to see what you can create in that. And so both kids and adults really enjoy Minecraft because they get to mine for great treasures and then go build things. So kids, Job 28 is the Minecraft chapter of the Bible. Listen to this. Surely there is a mine for silver and a place where gold is refined. Iron is taken from the ground and copper is smelted from ore. The miner puts an end to the darkness. He probes the deepest recesses for ore in the gloomy darkness. He cuts a shaft far from human habitations in places unknown to those who walk above ground. Suspended far away from people, the miners swing back and forth. Food may come from the earth, but below the surface is transformed as by fire. Its rocks are source of lapis lazuli, containing flecks of gold. No bird of prey knows that path. No falcon's eye has seen it. Proud beasts have never walked on it. No lion has ever prowled over it. The miner uses flint tool and turns up ore at the root of the mountains. He cuts out channels in the rocks. His eyes spot over every treasure. He dams up streams from flowing so that he may bring to light what is hidden. So what do these verses describe? What does this Minecraft chapter in the Bible describe? If we were to travel with the miner and dig for silver and gold, we could dig shafts miles and miles into the earth, and men have done that, and they have used ropes and pulley systems and God, with their great ingenuity, into the depths of the earth to find great treasures. And then verse 5 is a verse that farmers may not like, but he says that food may come to the earth. Farming is relatively easy when we think about the work of a miner. And men can do amazing things, so amazing in their mining technology that even animals can't see where they're going. Hawks fly over, and with their amazing sight, they can't see. And animals, with their courage, they can't go there. And they can search out lapis lazuli and gold and iron ore. But kids, even if you dig all the way down to the bedrock at the bottom of Minecraft, you can't find wisdom there. If you uncover everything, you cannot find wisdom. So the verse asks, where can wisdom be found? Where can it be located? Answer, after all these 26 chapters, the answer to that question, man, with his ingenuity to plan travel to Mars and explore the depths of the ocean and make atom colliders and break the speed of sound and decode DNA and smelt iron, cannot seek out the wisdom of God. And so Job goes on from the search for wisdom and speaks about its source and says, even if you had the greatest treasures in all the world, you couldn't buy it. Wisdom can't be bought. You can't seek it, you can't search for it on any path, and nor can you buy it with any treasure. And he goes on and describes the greatest treasures of this world and says, if you had gold and silver, and you could never have enough of that to finally buy wisdom. You could get all the treasures of this world and not be able to buy the secrets of how this world operates. So Job finally comes in verse 20 and following to this truth, that wisdom only comes from God. Wisdom only comes from God. And before he does that, he gives a final exploration and shows us once again the utter futility of attempting to find wisdom in this world. Where does wisdom come from, he says? Where is it located? It is hidden from the eye of every living thing and concealed from the birds of the sky. Abaddon and death say, we have heard news of it with our ears. Kids, this is like going to the nether in Minecraft. Or if you want a different analogy, think of the Balrog if you were in Middle Earth. If you could visit the underworld, even death would say he has only heard rumors of wisdom. And a final exploration from sky to the grave falls short. So is the search for wisdom doomed to fail? According to Job 28, yes. But God understands the way to wisdom. He knows its location. He looks to the end of the earth and sees everything under the heavens. And just to give one more example to show the futility of us ever finding wisdom, he and this is his example before he comes to that great climactic answer in Job 38, he gives just one example of God's wisdom, and that is a thunderstorm. Look at verse 25 with me. He says, when God fixed the weight of the wind and distributed the water by measure, when he established a limit for rain and a path for lightning, he considered wisdom and evaluated it. He established it and examined it. And perhaps, like me, you remember standing on the edge of a cornfield, standing in wonder as an amazing storm rolls in with lightning greater than any fireworks. And that's what we are called to see at this point. And rain, thunderstorms are so amazing because on the one hand, they bring life, but they also bring destruction. So whereas as a teenager, I found myself standing in wonder at the storm, now as an adult, when a storm comes in, I'm fighting with my insurance company about hail damage, and I continually am checking my sump pump through the night to make sure that my basement doesn't flood. Because a thunderstorm brings both life and destruction. And do you think that you can untangle everything that happens in just one thunderstorm? Yet God ordains it. He establishes it. He fixes it. He examines it. Just think of yesterday. All the things that we couldn't even predict from yesterday. I walk outside and it's pouring rain, but I look at the radar and there's no rain anywhere. Like, what's going on with that? And then last night we get tornado warnings and tornado watches. And then this morning, now it's snowing. How dare we think that we can figure out what's happening in the mind of God, and what frustrates and even embarrasses meteorologists declares the wisdom of God. So how far have we come? In Job 28, we've mined deeper than any of the mines of Moria. We've searched for great treasure only to find that what we seek, the answers to all of our deepest questions, are not found in this world. So does that mean that all that we've gone through up to this point is for nothing? No. We've learned so much along the way. Job's friends, Job's accusers, they represent the greatest wisdom that this world has to offer. They traveled from far to give their counsel to Job. They were leaders who traveled a great distance, but Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar were doomed to fail because wisdom cannot be found on this earth. And the wisdom of the wisest men of this world cannot understand and apply the justice of God properly. Instead, what we have found is that the wisdom of this world is at best cold and mathematical. The wisdom of man is a cruel friend, and it doesn't truly bring comfort. So we cannot comprehend God. So for 28 chapters, Job suffers and asks why. Job's counselors fall short. The poet sings, and finally, just for a moment, before we get to the conclusion, we finally hear God speak. In verse 28, he says to mankind, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to turn from evil is understanding. And Job ends with that final exhortation. What is wisdom? You can't search it out. You can't buy it. What is wisdom? Fear God and turn from evil. So how does that make you feel? After all of this, God simply says, fear God and turn from evil. A lot of commentators don't really like this verse because it feels trite. But I think Christopher Ashe beautifully sums this up like this. How we respond to this verse is a litmus test for our hearts, and saying In a saying that is crucial to the whole book, God directs our attention away from our agonized questions to himself. He does not take us by the hand and lead us to the answers. Rather, he beckons us to bow before the Lord himself, who knows the answers, but chooses not to tell us. Our eyes are directed away from the search for the architecture toward the person of the architect. We may ask, why doesn't God answer my question? To which he replies, turn your gaze and inquire away from the answer you want and toward the God that you must seek. In all our search for wisdom, we are not led to a place or to a formula, but to a person. And Job, he understands this with his mind, but he's now starting to understand this on a deeper level. He's becoming more comfortable with a wisdom that leaves questions unanswered so long as he can hear from God. And Job 27 and 28 are leading us to this important truth. The important truth that when you know the designer, you can be content even when you don't understand the design. When you know the designer, you can be content even when you don't understand the design. Fear God, like the thunderstorms, stand in awe and worship its beauty, but also know and fear its untamable power and turn from sin. And that won't answer every hurt or solve every riddle, but it's pushing us in the right direction. There's something greater than having all of our questions answered. That is trusting the person who eventually can. And Job 28 alludes, if only briefly, just for a moment, and this will become more clear as we continue throughout the book, that wisdom is not found in understanding the design, but wisdom is found when we know the designer. So what do we do when God doesn't show up? Like Job, we continue to plead our case and depend not upon our own righteousness, but on God who can vindicate us. And God eventually does show up. God showed up eventually for Job. God showed up eventually for the nation of Israel. And God will show up for us as well. Because the book of Job, book of Job continually pushes us to the glory of the cross. As Pastor Mike has been saying, our suffering helps us understand our suffering helps us understand and magnify Jesus Christ. So where is wisdom? In the book of Job, wisdom is still unseen. And Job argues it's better to know the designer than to understand the design. In the New Testament, where is wisdom? As we continue to get more revelation, where do we find wisdom? Wisdom hangs on a cross on a hill called Golgotha. And Job continually points us forward to the cross, to the greatest act of the wisdom of God, where God does not ignore our suffering, but he joins in it and he conquers it. So much so that in the book of Colossians, Paul can write that in Christ are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. In our suffering, God is not silent, standing in the shadows, but he is there. He is there in the cross. So as we continue to look forward to more answers and untangle all of this, we begin to learn that when you know the designer, you can be content even when you don't understand the design. Fear God and turn from evil and look to the cross for wisdom. When you know the designer, you can be content even when you don't know the design.